Vatican Observatory and president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. How else would I like to give this information? Here's the whiteboard. Theologian, philosopher, and one of the foremost voices in the church on the relationship of faith and science. He earned undergraduate and master's degrees from MIT and a PhD in planetary science in the renowned program at the University of Arizona. Winner of the Carl Sagan Medal from the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences, he has authored several books on astronomy and faith, including, most recently, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? And other questions from the astronomer's inbox at the Vatican Observatory. He is living proof in person, in word and deed, that there does not have to be an essential conflict between faith and science. Indeed, that the old conflict model of faith and science is outdated. Brother Guy is much in demand worldwide as a speaker, and we are greatly honored and privileged to have him with us this evening. Please welcome Brother Guy.
Thanks to all of you for showing up. It looked to be a pretty stormy day, but the weather, the clouds are parted, and here we are. Actually, if we can turn down the lights, because I've got pretty pictures. And you've seen me, okay, you don't have to look at it. I'm offering adventures. One adventure that took place was about 10 years ago. My colleagues from Northern Arizona and the University of Oklahoma, the three of us had gotten time on the world's largest telescope, the Keck telescope, which is on top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii. And Mauna Kea is about 15,000 feet, 5,000 meters. There's no air up there. It takes a week to get acclimated. When you get time on one of these telescopes, when they finally say, yes, you can have this night, they will actually fly you from America, from the mainland to Hawaii, put you up in this wonderful dormitory. They've actually moved it now so it's closer to the town of Hilo, but this was the one 10 years ago. It was a little village called Waimea. And I remember driving up there, there are signs that say, watch out for invisible cows. Because apparently the cattle can roam day and night. In the nighttime, they're impossible to see. But you get to the little village, and there is a high-speed connector between the operating room in that little house that you saw and the telescope up the hill. Because they know that there's no way in one night you could be acclimated, and they don't want you running $1 billion telescope and you can't remember what your name is. So the deal is, there is an actual camera on the person running the telescope at the top, and the people down in the control room. And then all the computers there that are exactly mirroring the computers up at the top of the hill. So we get there, and that's Steve, and he's about to tell them, we're ready to go, we've got our program set, we got the right instrument on the telescope, ready to open up the telescope. And the control person says, we're not opening tonight. It's snowing up here. Yeah, and in Hawaii it does snow. So we drew straws, one person stayed up in case the weather cleared, and the other two of us just went to bed. What else can you do? It's kind of interesting observing in this little village, because you can actually walk outside, walk across the street, get a McDonald's hamburger, and bring it back in when you're observing. We did get a couple of other good nights later, but this first run was kind of a disappointment. Well, I went to bed. Woke up the next morning about 7, Hawaii time, and I realized it's Sunday morning. And I'm a good Catholic boy, and I'm not a priest, so I can't just roll out of bed and say Mass for myself. Many of my friends are mad at me for not doing that, but that's the trouble of being a brother. So I look up on the internet, if the town has a McDonald's, it probably has a Catholic church. And it did. So I went over to Ascension Catholic Parish in Waimea. These are pictures I got off the internet. And of course, half the people in the parish are tourists. It's Hawaii. And the pastor gets up and he says, "Do we have any visitors? Stand up and make yourself." So we all stand up. And oh, where are you? You're from Ohio. Oh, wonderful, glad to see you. And you're from California. Oh, it's so nice that you could be here. And everybody introduces themselves until they get to me. And, what do I say? So I just told them the truth. I said, "I'm here because I'm an observer from the Vatican." What does it mean to be an observer from the Vatican? Well, I'm going to show you a little movie that I think does a better job than I could do with just talking, because the narrator himself is brilliant.
Both science and religion are conversations about the universe. They're ways of learning how we interact with this universe. It's not simply a question of, is there a God? But there is a God. Now what do we do? It's not just a question of, there are a bunch of stars, but rather, why are there stars? How do they work? How does that tell us how things work here on Earth? The interaction that I see in my own life is that religion gives me the reason to do the science.
Back in the papacy before Francis was Benedict, and one of his lines in a final elocution to the fathers of the General Congregation was, "Go to the frontiers." Well, there isn't much more frontier than 3.7 billion years away.
The first official interest of the Church for astronomy started in 1582 with the reform of the calendar. Then in 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to have an observatory to show that the Church is not against science, but the Church promotes good science.
They start off by having telescopes on the Tower of the Winds, and then on the walls surrounding the Vatican, as the city lights grow, and as the Italian government gives them back the territory up in Castel Gandolfo. In the 30s, they built new telescopes on the roof of the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo. Best telescopes of their era in the 1930s. By the 1980s, light pollution makes those telescopes unusable, so we built a new telescope in the dark skies of Arizona.
I'm Father Jean-Baptiste Kikwaya Eluo. I'm working in 3 projects. The first one is NEOS, Near Earth Object. So what I'm doing with NEOS is just observe them using our modern telescope VAT. The second project is meteors. So I worked on very faint meteors, what we call shooting stars. And the third project is set fireball network. They will have 4 cameras here around Tucson, so that actually we can monitor any fireball getting into the Earth atmosphere in the region.
This telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, it was the first of the new technology telescopes that has been considered pretty much the norm now in developing telescopes. With the advance of computer technology, we have the capability of bringing that advanced technology directly into our telescope. So it's an expandable, it's almost like it's a living machine, so it can grow as technology grows.
It is still very important to maintain scientific research at the Vatican, simply because there is still a lot of confusion about this relationship between science and faith. We are not out here trying to prove the existence of God by looking through a telescope. That's not what we're doing. But we can say that if we want to obtain any reasonable results looking through that telescope, we need to do it embracing a certain work ethics that is, in fact, the same work ethics that the Bible itself tells us through commandments and through the Gospels to embrace.
look at the stars and wonder. They want to know, what is that? What is that about? How do I fit in? They hear about the moon landing, and they want to know, what was that like? If we're part of the human race, we're part of the race that went to the moon. We're part of the species that looked at the stars and wondered, what the heck are those things? Looking at the sky reminds you that there's more to the universe than what's for lunch. What's more, if you believe in a universe that God so loved that he sent his son, then not only are you going to want to study the universe because it's kind of cool, it's an act of worship. It's an act of getting closer to the Creator and getting closer to a universe, as St. Athanasius said 1,500 years ago, was cleansed and quickened by the Incarnation. Then, doing science is an act of worship.
So that gives you a sense of what the observatory does. And I want to tell you now a little bit of what it's like to be an observatory as part of the Vatican. Now, the Vatican's a very confusing and complicated place, but fortunately we have the internet, which can explain to you exactly how the papacy works. The Jesuits run everything, including the National Bankers, the Illuminati, the Opus Dei, Masons, New Age, and of course the Mafia. It's all the revelations. If that doesn't help, a less confrontational site still reminds you that the Curie has got congregations and secretariats and tribunals and councils and commissions and who knows what all. The simplest way to think about it actually is there are two parallel Vaticans. The Pope is at the top, and then there's a cardinal who's the Secretary of State who runs all the church stuff. And there's a cardinal who's the mayor of Vatican City. And he runs all the Vatican City government stuff because the Vatican is, on top of everything else, an independent nation. Worked hard to get that status. Once a year, the Pope invites all the heads of all of the groups, the people who directly report to him or report to somebody who reports to him, and they gather together in an audience. These are famous because usually he sits and shouts at people, or maybe not shouts, but he reprimands those who are a little bit too worldly. Something that I could never be accused of, maybe too otherworldly, I'm not sure. but I do want to show you, you have assigned seating, and if you look very carefully, that's me. In the very last row, but I'm in the room. I've actually been appointed by the Pope. Which is interesting because the Vatican Observatory gets its budget from the city-state, but I don't report to the mayor of the city-state. I report instead directly to the Pope. Which means that I'm kind of on call either way. These are things just to remind me of the story. There's no way you can read any of this. About last December, I got a letter from the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. I bet you didn't know there was an Office for Outer Space Affairs. But they had been in touch, they're in Vienna, they had been in touch with the Vatican diplomats in Vienna, and they wanted to have a big meeting in June about the peaceful uses of outer space. And have a workshop ahead of time to actually decide what they were going to have decided by the time of that meeting. So at the Vatican Observatory, we volunteered to host the workshop. We've got a beautiful site in Castel Gandolfo. We could get 25, 30 people in the room. And, beautiful site, beautiful tourism, but also a very friendly place to talk. And about a month before the meeting, I said, do you want to actually have any scientists who work in space? Oh yeah, that'd be good. I'm figuring, who can I get on a month's notice to pay their own way to come to Rome? So I asked 5 friends, and they all said yes. And they're in that list of people that you see on the other side. It was amazing. I could go on up for hours about the things I learned on how space actually affects nations. 90 nations of the UN have an office of outer space of one sort or another. a space program or a space office. It's not because everybody's building rockets, but everybody is using space data, to map where the land usage, to map where the water, where's the drought, to have data that their students in their universities can use. The students in Kenya are building a CubeSat to be launched in one of the rockets in the next couple of years. That was great. And then they said, well, of course, Guy, you'll be coming to the big meeting in June. I don't want to go. I'm not a diplomat. I don't have not only do I not have the fortitude to be a diplomat, I don't have the bladder to be a diplomat. I'm mostly sitting in a room listening to people talk. And they kept inviting me, and I kept coming up with a good excuse, until a week before the meeting, I got a letter from the Secretary of State telling me that I was appointed the head of the Vatican's delegation, so I better be there. How many people here ever did Model United Nations when you were in high school? Yeah, I did. And the only difference between Model UN and the real UN is that the chairs are more comfortable in the real UN. But for 2 days, we sat in an auditorium in Vienna and listened to diplomats get up and give canned 8-minute speeches prepared by somebody back in the Home Office that basically said, space is good, peace is good. And I had my own document that was prepared by the Secretary of State, which said, space is good, peace is good. I turned their English into English, but basically I was saying what they were saying. And, after 2 days, we all said our piece. What could be less controversial than to say space is good, peace is good? Except this happened to be the week that President Trump had announced the idea of a military space force. So suddenly saying space is good, peace is good was a political thing. And this is how it came out in the newspapers, as if the Pope is astronomer, as if it was me saying that, space is good, peace is good, and this is controversial. The one irony is that there is one line in the document they gave me where I'm quoting something that Pope Francis said about space. That's the only line in the document that actually I wrote. Because I had written it for the Pope 2 months earlier. This is how documents are done. This is my little adventure into the world of diplomacy. People write things. No politician actually writes the speech. They may go over the speech, they may change it, they may adapt it, or they may just read whatever is placed in front of them. They have so many speeches to give, there's no way they could write every speech. But even some famous speeches, Ted Sorensen, was often accused of being the guy who wrote the John F. Kennedy famous inaugural address. And a good speechwriter will, of course, defer and say, no, it was the man himself who wrote it. And when people insisted to Sorensen, did you actually write John F. Kennedy's famous inaugural speech? His reply was always, ask not. I can tell who of you are old enough to know the speech I'm talking about. Kids, ask your parents, or maybe your grandparents. I arrived at the Vatican in 1993, back in the days when I was skinny and had a red beard. And I really didn't know quite what I was getting into. But in fact, I call this Adventures of a Vatican Scientist because I realized that living in the Vatican is itself not just an adventure. It's like being in an adventure novel. We're one of the few absolute monarchies out there. And I'm fascinated by science fiction. I go to science fiction conventions. I get asked, what's it like to actually have a king? What's it like to actually have an absolute ruler? How many fiction novels actually get it right? An awful lot of them don't. This one does. This is actually, if you want to read a nice fantasy novel, it's not full of grimdark. Highly recommend this one. Some of the things that it gets right is to point out that even if you're an absolute monarch, even if you're an emperor, your power is limited by the very practical fact that only things that your underlings want to get done gets done. We've all worked in offices, I suspect, where your boss gave you a pile of 12 things to do, and you kind of decided to do the things that you wanted to do first, and the things you didn't want to do got kind of to the bottom of the pile in the hopes that he wouldn't be boss by the time you got there, and everyone would forget he was supposed to do that. If you're a leader, you have to be able to figure out a way to encourage people to do the things you want to do, to make them also want to do the things you want to do. And if you can't do that, you're in trouble. It means that, forget about the organization charts. What's really important is who knows who. Who are your allies? Who are your enemies? The enemy of your enemy becomes your ally. There's about 800,000 people who work at the Vatican. It's basically a big high school. They all know each other. They all have lunch in the cafeteria together. And these are all good people. They're not, nasty people. They're not all the backstabbing that you hear about. I never saw any of that. But they're people. And they all have human peculiarities and human traits and things that they like to do or not like to do. And the goal of a good leader is to figure out how to get things done using the personal context, using the personal friendships, working by unwritten rules. They made me the director of the Vatican Observatory 3 years ago. I had no idea I was going to get the job. I was completely unprepared for it. And I'm an American, and everything's done in Italian. And I don't just mean the language, I mean the culture. I don't have that connection. I don't have that network. I don't have those friends. And so what I wound up doing was every time something needed to be done, I'd go to the person who's responsible for giving me this favor, like next year's budget, and I'd tell them the total truth. I have no idea what I'm doing. What should I be doing here? Or better yet, this is what we want to have happen. How should we go about doing it? So they were not the enemy stopping me from doing what I wanted. They were my friend and my ally. And I was their protege. And suddenly they'd be looking out for me because I was fitting into their connections of who's your friends and who's your enemies. And you do that to everybody and you wind up basically getting what you need. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes. One of the really important things, though, is to know who's the friend. There was a time when the head of the Vatican Gardens desperately wanted to take over the Jesuits' headquarters and community building, the floor that we had in the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo. And every year he proposed that we would kick the astronomers out. And every year George Coyne, then the director, would write to his friend, an astronomer in Poland, Michael Heller, who would write to his friend from going back to when they were in school together, a fellow named Karl Olieta. And we stayed where we were going, But of course, the bad thing with these backroom connections is as soon as Pope John Paul II died, we were kicked out. Which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Because living in a building that was built in 1595 that is a palace sounds glamorous until you realize, look at that beautiful building. That's where we lived, that's where I lived for 17 years, where the observatory was housed for 70 years. Beyond the fact that you realize it's a beautiful old building, you also notice it needs paint. It always needs paint. If you're in a building that has high ceilings and hard walls, it's noisy. It echoes. Now, the echoes are sometimes useful because back in the days before they had PAs, that's the only way your voice to be heard. And I do remember once when I was in Africa, in a cathedral where the power went out, and I suddenly understood. If you're talking like this without a microphone, can anybody in the back hear me? Yeah. But just barely, because this actually has pretty good acoustics. But if I'm talking like this, only I'm singing, everybody can hear me. Hallelujah, hallelujah. That's why we sing at Mass. So that the voice can be heard. That's why opera was invented. And I can go into the physics of the acoustics of the human voice and why the upper register that gets emphasized in singing actually propagates much better. But when you don't want that to happen, these rooms are noisy as heck. You never hear about that, just the closest I can think of is the Monty Python routine. Where, what did you say? We did that. Blessed are the cheesemakers. These old buildings, of course, don't have air conditioning. They didn't have central heating, though they do now. You get lots of moisture in the walls, on the walls, mold growing. You never hear about that in the fantasy novels. Also, you've got animals. You've got mules that are carrying things up 5 stories because they don't have elevators. You've got dogs and cats and rats and the pollution that they produce. It can smell after a while. Speaking of which, where does the water come from? You're building a castle on the top of a hill. How do you get the water up there? The region where Castel Gandolfo is located is the Alban Hills near Lake Albano, and it was a place where the Romans had aqueducts carrying the water down into Rome. But in the year 100, the Emperor Domitian decided to build a palace there, and he had to have, of course, a guard around him, the Second Legion, who built the city of Albano, and they needed water. They needed sanitation. This is what they did. The waterworks built in the year 100 are still used to water the gardens of the town of Albano. And 100 years ago, they actually provided the drinking water. But you can imagine the engineering involved in that. And somehow they never tell you about that in the fantasy novels. The building that we were in was 6 stories tall, and it was built without, metal framework, which meant that the lower walls, this is the 3rd floor, and you can see that's how thick the wall is to carry the weight of the walls above, which get thinner and thinner as you go to the top of the wall. But there are all sorts of practical things, like where does the food come from? I read Cinderella now, and I'm wondering, who actually was, controlling the mice? Where did that pumpkin come from? Who were the pumpkin growers? What was the economy of growing pumpkins? Where does the staff come from? Who trains them? Where do the bodyguards come from? I mentioned the bodyguards of the emperor. The emperor's bodyguards in the year 100 all came from Turkey, from the Middle East. You wouldn't want local Italians guarding the emperor because the local Italians are more loyal to their families than they are to the emperor. Who trains all these people? You've got to have bookkeepers. Who teaches the bookkeepers? You've got to have people who are going to be soldiers. Who trains the trainers of the soldiers? This requires a lot of money. This requires a very complicated economy. The Vatican City-State has a budget of about 300 million euros a year, of which 1.5 million euros goes to the Vatican Observatory, about 0.5%, which incidentally is the same fraction of NASA's budget with the U.S. government, but the U.S. government, pays more than the Vatican pays the Swiss guards. So the bottom line is a little different. Where does the money for the Vatican City-State come from? I discovered, to my astonishment, it's not the stuff you chip in for Peter's pence. That goes to the other side of the Vatican. All the money from the Vatican City-State, what they live on, is the proceeds from the Vatican museums. Anytime you go to the museum, and they're well worth going to, there's a long line of people to get in, and thank heavens, because that's what pays my salary. And then, you can ask yourself, if you are the king, what do you actually do all day? Most popes have to get up at 4 in the morning to get any work done on their own, because by 6:30 they're on display in public and can't work on any writing or anything else. You spend an awful lot of the day signing stuff. As the director of the observatory, I'm handed a stack of papers once a week, and my secretary, who's a good Italian guy who knows my taste in bad movies, sits them in front of me and goes, work, 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 work. And if anybody knows what movie that's a reference to, he's not nearly as pretty as the people in Blazing Saddles. But I do feel like the government lieutenant. You just wind up signing stuff that you may not even have a chance to read. You do have meetings with your staff to get your ideas to them, to get them to the people to try to motivate them. But, nobody loves staff meetings, and trust me, the guy running the staff meeting doesn't like them either. And then there are important people who want to see you because they think you can do something. Foolish them. Nonetheless, they desperately want to have pictures with you. In the days when we were living in the Papal Palace, that was my bedroom, the little circled room, and it overlooked the courtyard where the popes would hold the Angelus every Sunday. This is what I saw out my window, a series of pictures in the last days of Pope John Paul II. He was not able to walk much anymore. He had a chair on wheels that they would wheel out. He would give his little address. He came out looking really weak, and then the audience would give him energy, and he would get more and more animated, more and more enthusiastic, and it was just a delight to watch. But it was also incredibly moving because, you saw the picture of me back with JP2 when he was young and vigorous, and you go, he's just another guy. He puts on his cassock one leg at a time. But by the end of his life, the weaker he got, the more powerful he got. It was just amazing to see not only him, but the reaction of people around him. To see how he would get energy from them and he would give energy to them. This frail man who was clearly so phenomenally holy. And after he's done that, out in public, giving the talk, encouraging people, then the line starts. And continues, and continues. Until finally, they would have wheel him back inside. That is not easy work. That is absolutely draining and exhausting work. And that's something that a leader has to do. When Leo XIII, the Pope back in the 1890s, saw two issues with the church, as a leader, he came up with a clever solution. The two issues were, number one, the church was being accused of being anti-science. That idea that church and science were at war with each other really only arises in the 1880s and 1890s. It does not go back to Galileo. Galileo was a good Catholic. It really comes up in the 1890s. He wants to show the world that the church supports good science. But at the same time, he also wants to show the world that the Vatican, which by then had been reduced to just the area around St. Peter's, was still an independent country. And so having a national observatory that would be recognized as a national observatory by other nations was a way that de facto the Vatican was recognized as a nation. And this worked well into the 1920s. Hidden away in a secluded corner of the Vatican, the Great Observatory. Back in the days when the telescopes were on the walls around the Vatican, walls that dated from the year 800, and yet within the shadow of St. Peter's. Massive telescopes that swing to a touch as easily as a rod, whatever that means. you'll see running this telescope was a fellow named Johann Hagen. He was originally from Austria, came to Minnesota, worked there many years, and then was called to Georgetown University, where he ran the observatory there. And in the year 1900, was asked to come back to Europe as the head of the Vatican Observatory. At the same time, he was the spiritual director of Elizabeth Hasselblad, who founded the Brigittine order and has just been made saint. So you have a fellow who's not only a humdinger of an astronomer, but also the religious director of the saint. And here is the photographic telescope. Very interesting, different design. Was designed to actually photograph a section of the sky. There were 18 telescopes and 18 national observatories. Every observatory was given a separate part of the sky to photograph. The Vatican had one section of the sky, and Italy had a separate section because they had two different independent observatories. They started the project in 1891. It pretty much ground to a halt in 1950, mostly done. There's now a telescope being built in Chile that will redo what this thing took 60 years to do. We'll do it 3 times a week. So that was 1929. In 1929, the Vatican in Italy finally signed a treaty where the Vatican was given back its territory like the Papal Palace. And Father Hagen died. Pius XI, the Pope then, asked around, do we want to continue a Vatican observatory or not? And he found a group of German astronomers who were willing to do it, and he said, we're going to send you out to the darker skies out in Castel Gandolfo. That was the Pope's summer bedroom. That was my office for 17 years. I was the only guy in the Catholic Church who could claim to be above the Pope. As I say, we were kicked out of there after John Paul II died. But the person who kicked us out had managed to make enemies. And so his enemies decided to help the observatory and determined that we were going to be given a beautiful, much more modern, 1632, much more modern building that was completely remodeled on the inside. And it would be what we'd say in English, a feather in the cap of the Vatican, something they could brag about. The Italian is flower in the lapel. I like that.
Benedict XVI blessed the new headquarters of the Vatican Observatory. It's a new set of buildings about a mile from the old headquarters south of Castel Gandolfo. The group was accompanied by the Jesuits that direct the observatory. They showed him around the new installations, telescopes, and pieces of meteorites from their collection. The Vatican Observatory changed its headquarters because it required more space to accommodate the large number of students and researchers that work there. Before, the observatory was in the summer residence of the popes. But for security reasons, the number of visits were limited. The new center has a conference room, more classrooms, a library, and a space for the Jesuit community that's separate from the space from students and researchers. Though a large part of the activities of the observatory are done at another center in the Arizona desert, the observatory in Castel Gandolfo is still a point of reference for astronomical investigation. With their observatory, the Vatican is securing a place in the area of world astronomical research.
So what we've got there are a wonderful computer setup. You spend 1 week every 6 months at the telescope, then you spend 3 months trying to figure out what went wrong, and 3 months planning for the next time you get 1 week at the telescope. You could do all of that in Castel Gandolfo. Much more comfortable than in Rome. We have a library. You saw the Pope looking at it. That's a copy of the Copernicus Revolutions. It's not a first edition. It's not a second edition. It's only a third edition. And it's a pirate edition from, it was printed in the Netherlands. But it's from 1617. You want to do history of astronomy, you could just walk across the hallway, go into our library, and pull the books off the shelves. Not that anybody we know has ever done any of that. There's a historian of science over there. Pretty good deal. The third thing we have there, though, is the collection of meteorites. And that's my baby. That's what I've done for a living. I'm somebody who studies these rocks that fall from the sky. This particular meteorite that Pope Benedict is holding is actually a piece of planet Mars. And if you want to know how do we know it's from Mars, I'll tell you what I told him. Per causa di sottopi che si può trovare in questi meteoriti, è possibile da calcolare. And then he said, let's speak in English. For a lot of reasons, chemical reasons, it contains things that are identical to what you find on Mars. That's all you need to know. The other thing I want to point out, though, is this picture wound up on the front page of the Observatory Romano, the Vatican official newspaper. And I wrote to my mom with a copy saying, look at me, I'm on the front page. Do you see me? That little piece of black that the AP thing is written on top of, that's my sleeve. And if you don't believe me, here's the other view. You can see the photographer taking that picture. Francis has also come and visited. We showed him a meteorite from Argentina, which was kind of a lot of fun. And as I say, we hold workshops there to this day. A year ago, May, we had a wonderful workshop on black holes, singularities, and all those crazy things people always ask us about, in honor of the guy who invented the Big Bang Theory, a fellow named Georges Lemaitre, who happened to be a Catholic priest. He's not a Jesuit, he was not a member of our observatory, he was a diocesan priest. Proof that it is possible to be a diocesan priest and smart. Rare is At the observatory today, in fact, we have 11 researchers. We come from around the world. One of them, in fact, is a diocesan priest, and he's brilliant. But everybody in the group comes in with a doctoral degree and their own little corner of astronomy and their own collaborators. So Rich Boyle is from the U.S., but he has collaborators in Lithuania. And David Brown is from the U.S., but he did his degree at Oxford, where he met collaborators who are Chinese. I'm from the U.S., but I work with people who I met in Antarctica who come from Britain. Chris Corbley is British, but he did his studies and actually works with Americans. Richard D'Souza is Indian, and he's actually doing his last year of a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan. Paul Gabor is he's got a Hungarian name, a Slovak citizen, he's in the Czech province of the Jesuits. He did his studies in philosophy in Poland, in Polish, in theology in France, in French, and of course, growing up before the wall fell, he learned Russian, and his mom was an English teacher, so he speaks perfect English. And there's 7 languages right there. Gabriele Giunti is both a redhead from Naples and a mathematician, so he's crazy 3 times over. And he's brilliant. He works in string theory. He actually understands string theory. Jean-Baptiste Kekwaya, who is probably the biggest guy, works on the tiniest things. He does these microscopic dust particles that enter the atmosphere. Bob Mackey has taken over the meteorite collection from me. He's the one I got the real complaint about, because he's doing the kind of work that I used to do, only better than I did. You know, how do you dare do, but what the heck, I put up with that. Paul Muller, the philosopher, is the guy I wrote that book, we wrote together, When You Baptize in E.T. And Alessandro is an expert in galaxies and jellyfish galaxies, which is a whole different story. And in fact, he's a diocesan priest with a doctorate from Padua, and he works in a parish on Sundays in Padua and during the week at the University of Padua, but we pay his salary. There's another diocesan priest from Italy who's got a degree in cosmology and will be working with us over the next few years the same way. So even though the observatory was given to the Jesuit order, we're open to other people to come and work. We also have a whole staff of adjuncts, including women. Can't be a Jesuit, be a woman, unfortunately. But we do have women scientists who are affiliated with us, who can use our facilities, who can come and stay with us as they want. I mentioned meteorites. One of the great things about working at the observatory is that when I arrived, I was given one mission: do good science. It didn't depend on what the flavor of the week was back at NASA in the days when they were paying my salary. It wasn't something that I had to write a proposal to get approved before I could do it. It wasn't something where I better have results after 3 years or the money's going to dry up. Or after 6 years or else I won't get tenure. One of the things I had done early in my career, I was nearly 40 before I joined the Jesuits, so I had a long career. One of the things that I had done before was to make numerical models of how asteroids evolve. And to know that, you have to know the physical properties of the things that make up the asteroids. Well, meteorites are the things that make up the asteroids. We have meteorites in our lab. And I wanted to do a model and say, okay, so how dense is a meteorite? That'll tell me how dense the asteroid is. And I looked around and no one had ever measured it. Certainly there are maybe 2 or 3 numbers, but no one had ever measured meteorites systematically. Number one, it takes 10 years to get enough data to really see patterns. For number 2, meteorite curators don't want to hand over their meteorites to somebody else doing messy experiments. Density. What's a density? Why is a density important? Anybody here celebrate Christmas? Like with presents? When I was growing up, the deal was you could open one present before you went to Christmas Mass. You wanted to make sure it was a good one. You didn't want to, use up your one present on a box of socks, right? So, how do you know whether the box has socks or chocolate? Or even better, a book? You pick it up and you feel its heft. The weight it has for a given volume, that's what we call density. And that's how we know what's inside a planet. We can't see inside a planet, but we see from how much mass there is and how tightly packed it is, you can work out what things must be there that could give it that density, low density or high density. But how do you measure the density of a rock? It's the volume divided by the mass. Well, the mass is easy. You put it on a scale, you see how much it weighs. But how do you measure the volume of a really irregular thing like a rock? And the classic technique, going back to Aristarchus, was you drop it in water. Archimedes. And you drop it in water, you see how much water comes out when the rock goes in. But no one is going to let you drop meteorites in the water. Because meteorites have rare chemicals that can get dissolved in the water, and pieces of iron that can get rusted in the water, and you just don't want to do that. So I was thinking, I got this meteorite collection. There's 1,000 meteorites at the Vatican, and I'm the curator. I'll give myself permission to do the experiments. But I don't want to ruin them either. I need a fluid that won't get into the cracks, and that won't chemically react with the rock, and yet completely cover the outside. Pardon me. So, every day at 10 o'clock, everything stops. We all go to the cappuccino room where they've got this big industrial strength cappuccino machine, and a guy named Luigi who runs it. One day, there was a priest from the College of the Holy Cross in Rome. Brilliant guy, but it's an Opus Dei college, and we're a bunch of sloppy Jesuits. And he's a very, very proper Opus Dei priest. And we invited him to come out and do some research with us, and he's delighted to do it. He's brilliant. But he's really uncomfortable hanging out with Jesuits, because you know what those Jesuits are like. So we invite him to coffee. And he's going, well, okay, so he's dressed in a collar and the French cuffs and all that. No Jesuit would ever be caught dead. You know how to find a Jesuit in Greenwich Village? He's the one guy not wearing black. So, we're wearing t-shirts, and he's there all dressed up in a collar. And Luigi sees him walking in, and he goes, oh, Padre! He goes, Padre! He goes, Padre! Benvenuto, welcome. Cappuccino? And he goes, no cappuccino, Opus Dei. So those who don't get cappuccino is the Italian word for cappuccino. Anyway, I'm making my cappuccino. and I'm pouring sugar. When I see the sugar coming off the spoon, I'm thinking, sugar powders act like a fluid. Oh, thank you.
Now my voice is entirely different.
Well, I don't want to pour sugar on my meteorites, but what I can pour on my meteorites are glass beads. You have a cup of known volume, you fill it with glass beads, you shake it, you scrape it, you weigh it, dump out the beads. Put in the rock, fill the rest with the beads, shake it, scrape it, weigh it, and the difference in the weights tells you the density of the rock compared to the density of the beads. And it works. And then somebody says to me, yeah, that's the density if you include the pore spaces, the cracks. You want another fluid that actually will penetrate all of the cracks in the rock, and then when you compare the two volumes, you know how much of the rock is cracked and how much of it is rock. And that tells you how stiffly put together the rocks are. I need a fluid that penetrates everything. Helium gas. So this other gizmo over here, you've got a tank, you can pressurize to 2 atmospheres of helium. You put the rock in, you put the plug in, you pressurize that to 1 atmosphere of helium, you measure the pressures, you open the valve, and they equalize. The bigger the volume of the rock, the higher the final pressure, because the rock is taking up space that normally would be taken up by gas. The only thing you have to do is to calibrate with objects of known volume. You know how you translate this volume into this pressure to that volume. So what we have are carefully crafted calibration spheres, numbered 1 to 15, stripes. Eventually, we got enough data that we got money from NASA to buy a commercial gizmo that will do that. And even better, to find a graduate student who would do the other measurements for us. And he did this for his thesis. Finally, in the last couple of years, laser scanners can do a computer scanning, and we don't even have to use the beads anymore. And Bob, since he doesn't have graduate students, has minions helping him out. That tells you how well put together the rock is. That tells you how dense the rock is. But if you want to know how much the rock heats up for a given amount of energy, you have to know the heat capacity. How much heat does it take to warm a rock up 1 degree? How much heat does it take to give it off when the rock cools down 1 degree? I have no idea how to measure this. Somebody must measure it, but I don't know how to do it. It turns out they only can do it on small samples that have to be very, very pure in meteorites or anything but. However, chatting with friends, we come up with this great idea. Imagine a dewar. A dewar is a technical term for basically a thermos bottle. This is our dewar. You can see that's Buzz Lightyear in the back there, but it's insulated. And it's filled with liquid nitrogen. And liquid nitrogen will slowly evaporate, but so the weight of the liquid nitrogen slows down until you drop the rock in, then it goes up by the weight of the rock. But once you drop the rock in, the rock is hot, the nitrogen is cold, and it boils away until the rock is at the temperature of the liquid nitrogen. And then it goes back to a nice straight line. And by seeing how much nitrogen got boiled away, you know how much heat came out of the rock. Not only does this give us really good numbers for heat capacity, it also gives me an excuse to play with meteorites. Meteorites, these rocks from outer space. You can hold outer space in your hand. It's touching you, you're touching it. And not only do you get to play with meteorites, you get to play with liquid nitrogen. Where do they get the meteorites? I mean, we have this collection of meteorites, but the best place to search for meteorites is in Antarctica. And 20 years ago, I had an adventure of a lifetime, being part of a team sponsored by NASA and NSF, living in Antarctica, driving across the ice, looking for black rocks on the ice. When we would find one, we'd collect it, put it in a plastic bag, record it, and then send it back to Houston. This particular one is chemically identical to a piece of the moon. But in order to do that, you had to be out in Antarctica on the plateau where the meteorites live. That was my home for 6 weeks. You'll notice the black panel on the tent. That was the solar power that powered things like our radios. So we could radio in every day to let them know we were still alive. You'll notice the anemometer in the back. One of my jobs was keeping track of the weather. It was cold. Behind there is a sled that had our food, frozen food. There was a bucket with ice. We would walk behind the tent and chip out ice, and that was our drinking water. The wind always came from the south, and the tent is facing so the wind doesn't blow in the door. So in this picture, you're looking to the south. Now there's also a show. Every morning, I would put on all my clothes, go outside, start up the snowmobile, drive a few hundred feet in the other direction of the wind, downwind, with the shovel, dig a little hole in the snow, park the snowmobile to block the wind, and then hope that I remembered to bring the toilet paper. For 6 weeks. It was like living in a different planet. It was like living in a science fiction novel. There were 4 men, 2 women. No, we did not fall in love. No, don't do that. We didn't have deep philosophical conversations about religion. You just don't do that. We did not at all talk about politics, because there's no way you can get away from these people. It's funny, you think that you're very much alone, but you're never alone because you're always with the other 5 people. And yet it did remind me of one of my favorite songs. Lord, you've searched me and known me when I sit down, when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away, pretty far away. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand will lead me. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me, the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day, for darkness is as light. It was literally true. I remember one night, I woke up in the middle of the night. I tended to wake up in the middle of the night. I had a little Tupperware of hosts that had been consecrated, and I'd have one a day, and do it in private when everyone else was asleep. And so I'm waking up, this is a good time, and I'm wearing my watch. You don't want to take the watch off because it'll get cold. So I bring the watch right up to my eye, and I can't see what time it is. And I'm thinking, I just bought this watch. It's got glow-in-the-dark numbers. How come I can't see it? Wait a minute. I'm in Antarctica, where the sun never sets. I'm wearing a mask. Because the night was as light. After 6 weeks living in the ice and then a week on either end in Murdo, not really talking much about religion, and feeling incompetent because everybody in Antarctica feels incompetent because you're wearing these big, stuffy suits. You've seen a 5-year-old overdressed and can barely walk. That's how we felt. And just feeling utterly inadequate, and certainly, where was my vocation in any of this? I took a week off and spent it in Lake Tekapo in New Zealand. You fly in and out of Christchurch to get to Antarctica. And the first day I was there, I was staying at a bed and breakfast and chatting with some of the other tourists. Actually had to come from Germany, so I was practicing my high school German, which was kind of fun. And they went on their way and had a great time. At the end of the week, the lady who runs the bed and breakfast says, would you like to come to church with us? Well, she says, there's this little church, you can see it here. And one week it's Catholic, and the next week it's Anglican, and the next week it's Presbyterian, and somebody comes out from Christchurch. And we sort of take turns what religion we are. It's an Anglican coming this week, but you can come along. And maybe you can talk to that woman. What woman? The one in the papers? There was a German couple who had come as tourists to visit New Zealand, and he stepped back to take a photograph and fell to his death in front of her. And she speaks no English, and she's on the other side of the world from anyone who knows her. And it's the weekend, she can't even get in touch with the consulate. They had found a bed and breakfast with a woman who spoke German, so she could get the basics done. But she says, Guy, you're a Jesuit. You can talk to her in German. I'm a meteoriticist. You know, I didn't think I had much pastoral. What the heck do you say to someone whose life has been shattered in an instant? Well, actually, I had learned enough that you don't say, you listen. The Anglican priest gave me a couple of good things to start the conversation, to get her thinking, okay, my life has changed. What do I do next? One foot in front of the next. Proceed. Keep moving. Don't be paralyzed. Don't panic. What do I do next? Who do I call? Where do I go? What decisions can I put off? I don't know if it did her any good, but it did me overall to be with her. To remember that the astronomy we do is great fun, and the meteorites are all great fun, but there's bigger things than meteorites, and there's bigger things in astronomy. How did I get involved in astronomy? Why that of any of the things I could have done? I was a Sputnik kid, you know, that was me back in 1957 when Sputnik went up. I developed a great love of science fiction. I read science fiction books avidly. They talk about the golden age of science fiction. Some say it was the 1940s, some the 1960s. The best answer is, what was the golden age of science fiction? 11. And I've done 11 for most of my life. And I discovered that MIT had the world's largest science fiction collection. So I went to MIT to read science fiction. That was me. I wrote science fiction for our magazine. But I also chose as a major Earth and planetary science because it had the word planets in it. Planets are places where people have adventures. And that got me into the brand new planetary science department at the University of Arizona. These are the first 10 graduate students. You can work out the male-female ratio pretty quickly. It was only recently I realized that except for Cliff, the guy behind me, who was Jewish, and me, I was Catholic, everybody else was lost. That's what science looked like in 1975. I loved the science. I was good at it. I enjoyed doing it. After I got my degree, I got a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. And then at MIT. I was in the big leagues. I was a utility infielder, but I was in the big leagues. And yet every day I'd walk across the Harvard Bridge, going to that skyscraper where my office was, and I'd turn around and walk home, and I'd lie in bed at night wondering, why am I doing astronomy when people are starving in the world? People ask me, so why does the Vatican have an observatory? Why does anybody have an observatory? Of what possible good is astronomy? It's not going to make you rich. It's not going to make you powerful now that we know that astrology doesn't work. You know? You get your DNA and said DNA is the astrology of the 21st century. You know, and it's not going to get you girls, at least it didn't work for me. What's the point of this? Why should I be worried about the moons of Jupiter when people are starving? And I didn't have an answer. So I quit. I said, I'm abandoning science. I've had fun doing this, but I'm going to join the Peace Corps. I'll go anywhere they send me. I'll do anything they ask me to do. And they sent me to Kenya. And they said, we're going to have you teaching in a high school way up in the middle of nowhere where there's no glass in the windows and no black on the blackboards, and you can teach everything and anything. And I said, sure, I can do that. Help people who need my help. And then they took a look at my resume and they said, no, actually, we're going to send you to the best high school in the country, where they have lasers in their labs and actually a computer building. 1983, and they had a computer building. And I said, sure, whatever you want. The president of Kenya came while my astronomy club there was in operation, and the kids built these spacecraft and showed President Daniel Arap Moi why Kenya should be the place to launch spacecraft. The space center of the world. Because it's on the equator, where the spin of the world is the fastest. And if you launch in the direction of the spin, then you're launching over the Indian Ocean. So if it blows up, you don't hurt anybody. It's for the same reason we launch in Florida. And these kids were really getting into it. As I say, kids in Kenya now are building actual satellites. As the president walked by, one of his entourage went up to one of the kids, gave him a big hug. And the kid goes, "Oh, Mom!" Because kids are the same everywhere. Even though I wasn't going to be a professional astronomer, I still liked the stars. I had my little telescope, and I brought it with me to Kenya. And I go out, and every weekend go to my friends in the Real Peace Corps. And I'd give talks about astronomy and what people were learning from NASA. And then I'd set up the telescope, and everybody in the village would come and look through it, and they'd see the craters of the moon. And they'd go, wow. And they'd see, the moons of Saturn, and the moons of Jupiter. Anybody here ever see the rings of Saturn through a little telescope? Okay. Of you people who have seen the rings of Saturn, have you ever seen the rings of Saturn and not gone, oh, wow? Because that's what people do. And that's what everybody in Africa did. Just like my family and friends in Michigan. And it finally hit me. In those days, I had a cat, really smart cat. Better at being a cat than I could be. But my cat never wanted to look through the telescope. Looking through a telescope and going, wow. Recognizing the universe and saying, this is wonderful, and I wonder. That's what the word wonderful means. What are those things? Where did they come from? How does that fit in with who I am? Who's responsible for that? What has anyone else figured out so far? What are the stories that Aristotle would tell, that Newton would tell, that Galileo would tell? How can I get in on telling these stories? How can I become part of this phenomenal human adventure? Because as human beings, we have a hunger not only to feed our bodies, but also to feed our souls. Because we don't live by bread alone. I read that someplace. Theologian once pointed out to me the Genesis chapter 1, opening chapter, which some people think is a book of science. It's a book of theology. But it is a book of science in this sense. When was Genesis written? Probably during the Babylonian captivity. This audience, I think you know what the Babylonian captivity is. There have been times I've had to explain that to people. During the Babylonian captivity, the rich and educated of Israel had been swept off to Babylon to do the work of the empire. And their kids had grown up, hearing all these stories about how the universe works according to the Babylonians. According to the Babylonians, human beings were made by accident. It was a mistake. It wasn't supposed to happen. But we clever human beings are getting around the gods, and we've done something they've never done. We built the city of Babylon, the pinnacle of human achievement. And the Jews want to tell their kids, no, it's not how it works. In the beginning, God said, God's already there at the beginning. God is not part of nature. God is supernatural. In the beginning, God said, deliberately, step by step, order by order, intends there to be a universe, and at every stage says, this is good. And what's the pinnacle? What's the goal? What is the ultimate in the story of creation? Human beings only the sixth day. What's the seventh day? Rest, the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the point of creation. The Sabbath is when you can stop worrying about feeding your stomach and lean back and do astronomy. This is why we were created. guys. I went back to America, got a teaching job at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. Had so much fun doing that that, I broke up with a girl I was dating. Thank heavens, she said. Thank heavens, I said. Brilliant person, but we were not right for each other. And I'm now pushing 40, and I'm thinking, what can I do with my life where I can capture this joy? If I became a Jesuit, I'm coming in my 40s. It's kind of late to get ordained, though I know some people who do. But I'm really not called to that. But I could be a brother and a Jesuit and teach at a university. So, in 91, I take vows as a brother. And of course, one of the vows you take is obedience, the only one that's really hard. Poverty, I was used to it, but a grad student. Chastity, I was used to it, but a grad student. Obedience. Under obedience, they ordered me to go off to Rome and eat that terrible food and live in that horrible palace and, do the science I wanted to do. But they also gave me the education in theology and philosophy to be able to reflect on what it was I was doing and why I was doing it. And a chance to read the great theologians of the age. So I've tried reading Runner. I've tried reading some of them. I have to say my taste is more of G.K. Chesterton's. Mm-hmm. The essence of all pantheism, he says in Orthodoxy, is that nature is our mother, but the main point of Christianity is this. Nature is not our mother, nature is our sister. Nature was a solemn mother to the worshippers of Isis and Cybele and to Wordsworth, to everything. But to St. Francis, nature is a sister and even more, a younger sister, a little dancing sister to be laughed at as well as loved. This is the theme of Laudato Si, when our generation's Francis quotes that Francis, to say that nature is not something we should worship or be afraid of or think we can exploit any more than you would worship or be afraid of, although I was afraid of my sister in that story. But the universe is God's creation, and we are God's creation. We share a same Father. And we treat creation as we would treat our sibling. And that's what we do in astronomy. So, why does the Vatican have an observatory?
Why does the Vatican have an astronomical observatory? For instance, you're the curator of meteorites at the Vatican. Why do they curate meteorites? Are they looking for the shooting star of David? What?
No, in fact, the whole idea of having astronomers really got started with the reform of the calendar back in the 1500s. And since then, just studying the universe is a great way to remind yourself that there's more important things in life than what's for lunch.
What is for lunch?
Thank you all for coming. And if you want to be part of the conversation, look us up on the web. Just Google the Catholic Astronomer, and you'll be astonished and amazed at the cool things you'll find there. Thank you, everybody.
We are going to have a reception in the Alumni Commons, which is in the building next door. But before we do, are you open? Sure. For some questions? We'll have time for a few questions, and you're all welcome to come to the reception.
There's lunch waiting, right? So we don't have to do it. But certainly, any questions about anything, any of the adventures, any of the people have got me? Yes, in the back.
A friend of mine from Texas said I should ask you what you think of high school science.
What do I think of high school science? A couple of times I've been, invited by wonderful high schools who have great science departments, and I have to say nice things about them. I chose to go to the Jesuit high school in spite of the fact that it had no science at it, and it really active science. High school science is great fun if you want to be a scientist. But if you want to be a scientist and you didn't get any science in high school, you haven't missed anything. And that means that I think the people teaching science in high school maybe need to realize that you have to have calculus, and you have to have at least an 18 or 19-year-old brain to be able to flip between the general and the specific and the specific and the general that science is all about. So what is the point of teaching high school science? There is a point to it. The first point is to teach the vocabulary. You learn more new words in freshman biology than you do in freshman French. And having familiarity with the words is there. And the other is to give students a taste, just a teaser of what science can be, to keep the enthusiasm going. But, you're not... I taught high school science in Kenya, and I know they're really good at memorizing equations and coming up with the answer, but a classic problem is, everybody, if you've had high school physics, knows that there's a connection between the length of the pendulum and the period of the pendulum, right? So you'd ask the students, true or false? The period of the pendulum depends on the length, which is true. True or false? The length of the pendulum depends on the period. As if by making the pendulum move slower, you could make it longer. And if you only memorize the equation, you think that it's true. But if you really realize that's a real pendulum, and learning how to do that, you can't do in high school. But if you want to be a scientist and you're in high school, this is the time when you will learn how to read, how to write, how to analyze. Where did I learn to analyze data? From analyzing poetry. To take a piece that seems strange, pull it apart. Why was a word used there instead of some other word? Why are the words backwards? What's he trying to say? Piece by piece, pulling it apart and then putting it back together and seeing it in a new light. What does every scientist spend most of their time doing? Sitting in front of a computer. Half of that time is writing. If you don't know how to write clearly, then someone else is going to get the grant money and you won't. If you don't know how to draw a figure so that immediately people can see what you're trying to say, then the person who does draw the figure will get the credit for the work, even if you did it 2 years earlier. Speaking from experience. If you don't know how to speak in public, then no one will understand. It's painful to watch so many scientists who have such brilliant ideas, and they have no idea how to get them across. It's like, watching a 6-year-old trying to tell a joke. High school is where you learn that stuff. So I don't know if there are any high school kids in this room, or kids are about to go to high school. Do theater. Boy, nothing trains you like being on stage and somebody drops their cue and you've got to fake until they can come up with it again. Thinking on your feet. Do yearbook. Do you realize that the majority of papers given at a scientific conference are given as posters? How do you learn how to put a poster together? Big pictures, little pictures, the flow of the eye. You learn that by doing the pages of a high school yearbook. All of it, and you're only going to learn this in high school. By the time you get to college, it'll be too late. So, yeah, there are really important things to learn in high school to be a scientist. And they're not necessarily the things that you thought they were. And if you want to take a physics course because it's fun, go right ahead. And it will be fun, and it'll whet your appetite. But don't think it's going to replace what you have to do when you finally get calculus. Yes?
Could you comment on the book by Thomas Horn, Exo-Vatican?
Oh, my favorite guy, yes. Oh, I gotta tell the story, right? Guy shows up, says he wants to visit the Vatican Observatory. He says he's a reporter. He says he's going to, and he's got a couple of things. He presents himself as a bona fide. And we have this long email exchange, and he asks me about extraterrestrials and ETs and all of that. And I write him long answers. And then a TV show shows up that shows that the Vatican is hiding aliens in the basement of its telescope. and Brother Consolmagno thinks that Jesus was actually an offspring of an alien and the Virgin. I'm going, I do? And I have the emails to show that he's absolutely lying through his teeth. he's taking words out of context or totally making stuff up. And at that point you go, do I try to raise a fuss? Oh, incidentally, he's promoting me by allowing you to download electronic copies of my book from his website, which he hasn't got the right to distribute for free. Thank you very much. A couple of things we've learned from this. Number one, I learned this from my dad. You don't complain because you just give more publicity to the guy. Tied into this, by the way, is, did you know that the Vatican has a telescope called Lucifer? It's on the internet. It must be true. On the same mountain as our telescope is a totally different telescope, run by a consortium of different universities, including one in Germany. And the one in Germany has built a camera that is attached to the telescope. And the money came from the Department of Education, and the Minister of Education was a German by the name of Teufel, which is the German word for devil. And so they thought, as a joke, they would come up with an acronym that spelled Lucifer for their camera. So number one, it's not a telescope, it's a camera. Number two, it's the Germans, not us. Number three, it was a joke. And number four, we had nothing to do with it. But it's all over the internet. Because, of course, secretly we're devil worshippers, and we're going to be so secret about it that we would name a telescope Lucifer. There are crazies up there. In some cases, the crazies do you good. There's no such thing as bad publicity, more or less. The other thing, though, that we learned is that we will never, ever, ever, anytime somebody wants to do journalism with us, we look them up on the internet first before we say yes. If they have UFO anywhere on their website, the answer is no. And if they plan to sell their film to any of the cable network television, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, we say no. History Channel used to be, at least it was the Hitler Channel. It's not even that anymore. The Science Channel, the Discovery Channel, they've gone to the lowest common denominator, and they do nothing but rubbish. And we just can't allow ourselves to be on the same, show. We can't be on the same network as ancient aliens. Which is kind of sad. It shows, though, that there's a hunger among people for science. And there's a hunger for science that feeds their sense of excitement. But reality is so much more exciting than bad science fiction. And, it's not like I object to it because it's science fiction. I object to it because it's bad science fiction. There's so much better science fiction out there if you want to watch that. Meanwhile, we decided, hey, if extraterrestrials will sell, why not write our own book? So we wrote, Would You Baptize an E.T., which is almost entirely not about E.T.s. But maybe somebody will catch the title if they think this is a fun idea. Yeah?
Just so we can settle the debate for good, Star Wars or Star Trek?
The answer is yes. Other questions? In the back, and this will probably be the last one because I think we're all running out of steam. Yeah.
How would you go about asking a 16th century pope or bishop to describe a heliocentric universe? Or how might you describe a heliocentric universe?
Couldn't be done.
Couldn't be done.
Everything you know about Galileo and the Galileo affair is wrong. I'll just set it right up. The truth doesn't make the church look any better. But the mistakes the church make are not the mistakes that people in the 19th century accused them of. There is a book about the scientific debate. What's the title of that book again? Against All Authority? And the author is over there. I'm making fun of him. But in fact, there's a lot of scholarship, not just a lot of good scholarship on what's going on with Galileo. The stuff that you see summarized in popular press gets the whole story wrong. At the time of Galileo, there wasn't good enough evidence to convince people of heliocentrism, and what they could see strongly indicated the opposite. I mean, are there any scientists in this room, any physicists, who I could ask, what do you think of Einstein's general theory of general relativity? It's the best we got. If you come up with something that's going to replace it, you're going to have to do a heck of a job to convince me. But if 1,000 years from now we haven't gone past general relativity, I'll be disappointed. For where we were in the 16th and 17th century, Tycho Brahe's system was as good as you could come up with. But at the end of the 17th century, Isaac Newton comes up with a new physics and a new way of describing things and a way of getting around some, not all, but some of the problems that the old heliocentric system had. And at that point, people are much more willing to say, okay, maybe there's something to this. And the parts that we can't explain will work on a different way of explaining them. It was not the case, just to go over three things. First of all, it was not the case that by making the sun the center instead of the earth, we were demoting the earth and saying human beings are no longer the most important. A lot of people seem to think, oh, the earth was the center of the universe. It was most important. The church didn't want to give up that. You read your Dante? What's in the center of the earth? Hell, the inferno. If the center meant the best, then inferno's the best place to be. It was just the opposite. The earth was the bottom of the universe, not the center. The second point, the people who came up with this system were not stupid people. And they were willing to look at the evidence and willing to look at the data and willing to try to come up with different ways of explaining what was going on. The debates in the 17th century weren't between Copernicus versus Ptolemy, because both of those systems by then had become obsolete and had been superseded by further ideas. And finally, think about Galileo himself. He was a good Catholic. His two daughters were nuns. Of course, he never married their mom. He was an Italian Catholic. He could have fled, gone to the north, hung out with the Protestants, who would probably have burned him at the stake faster than the Catholics would have had those ideas. He didn't do that. He put up with their terribly unfair trial that he experienced. And he did it because he loved the church, even when the church abused him, which is pretty astonishing. And aside to Galileo, that he doesn't get enough credit for. So, it's chapter 3 in the Would You Baptize E.T. book, so it's all fine. And what we really say is nobody knows, but it's a great story. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Well, you'll find it. We have the Vatican Observatory Foundation puts out a really cool calendar with really cool pictures, and I wanted to give it to the people who made this possible. So I'll be sure that you do. Yes, we'll go to it.